Hi, my name is Ian Plant, and I have a simple goal to share my vision of this beautiful world by educating and inspiring others in the art of nature and wildlife photography. 10 years ago, I left my day job to pursue full-time my passion for nature photography. Now, I spend hours, days, even weeks in the field, waiting for the perfect convergence of mood, light, and composition. And I constantly write about those experiences and talk to others to inspire people in the art of nature photography. I've written a lot about composition. It's a subject I'm very passionate about. Today, I'm going to share some of my top pro secrets with you. These lessons will help you transform your photography and allow you to see the world in a different way. And most importantly, these techniques will allow you to share your own personal vision with others in ways you've never before imagined. Are you ready? Let's get started. So the first question that arises is, why is composition important? Well, if you want to make photographs that get noticed, it's vitally important that you master the art of composition. Although composition can be a complex topic, there are basic strategies that seem to arise again and again in photography that are the cornerstone of powerful image making. If you master these techniques, you'll go a long way towards breaking away from the pack. Composition can help you transform even the mundane and everyday into something that's sublime and inspiring to your viewers. The second question that arises is, what is composition? Well, at its most basic level, composition is a visual structure that's imposed upon artistic expression. It involves the selection and positioning of visual elements within the picture frame. Now, this is a pretty dry definition, not very exciting, so I think we need to give this another try. Composition is more than just a visual structure. It is your way of telling your subject's story. Composition entices both emotionally and visually viewers to enter into the scene. It is your way of showing them the world that you see through your eyes. A good composition will invite the viewer into that world and allow them to participate in the picture that you've taken. A friend and colleague of mine once said that composition is striving to come up with a solution to the never-ending, constantly changing visual puzzle that is our universe. But with photographic composition, the puzzle pieces move. Our world is constantly in motion. Everything is always changing. So for the photographer, the unique challenge of composition is to find a way to get all these moving, random puzzle pieces to come together in a pleasing way. The first step in figuring out how to make all these puzzle pieces fit together is choosing where to stand. Ansel Adams, one of the great pioneers of landscape photography, once said that a good composition is knowing where to stand. So for the photographer, you have to be mobile. You have to get around. You have to assess all the different lines, the different angles, different positions. You have to be curious and you have to explore so that you can find the right place to bring your subject to its fullest potential. So how does someone figure out the best place to stand to create a good composition? Well, you've probably heard of something called the rules of composition. I've only got two rules of composition. The first rule is, there are no rules of composition. The second rule is, there are no rules of composition. That rule was so important, I had to say it twice. Forget the rules. Throw the rules out the window. If you play by the rules, your images will never stand out from the pack. Instead of rules, I'm going to give you powerful tools. Knowing when and how to use these tools is the key to unlocking the hidden potential of your photographs. I have a way of conceptualizing composition. I call it visual flow. The goal of visual flow is to create an active progression of visual elements that entice the viewer to look deeper and deeper into the composition. If your viewers can't tear their eyes away from your photographs, you know you're doing something right. Imagine it this way. You're standing in a river and you're looking downstream. The water is flowing beneath you and going farther and farther into the distance. Nothing stops the water on its journey into the distance. This irresistible pull is exactly the effect you want to achieve with your compositions. You want viewers to be swept away visually by your photographs. You want them to be drawn into the scene, unable to tear away. Composition may seem like a daunting and complex subject, but it's easier than you think. I like to tell people, if you can see it, you can do it. If I can show you a photograph and explain the compositional techniques used to create that photograph, and you nod your head and say, oh yeah, I get it, I can see that, well, nothing will stop you from taking that lesson and applying it to your own photography. It may take some practice. You're definitely going to have some time behind the camera, behind the lens to get it right, but eventually you'll get it. Here's another way to think about why composition is important. If you're just putting your camera in front of your face and taking pictures of anything that catches your interest, you're not really doing anything other than creating snapshots. You're not taking the picture, the camera is taking the picture for you. Composition is important because it allows you to create an artistic vision of the world. It allows you to go beyond the mere snapshot and to show the world in a way that most people don't see. When learning how to master composition, you've got to start from the ground up. A good composition is a lot like a sturdy building. The best designs start with a stable foundation, and that foundation is the power of abstract thinking. Our world is made up of familiar physical elements, things like trees, rocks, bears, and flowers. But things aren't really what they appear to be. If you really want to master composition, you have to master the art of abstract thinking. You have to learn to see things in a non-literal way. For example, let's take a bear. The average person, when they see a bear, well, they see a bear. The artist doesn't see a bear, however. The artist sees a shape. The artist sees a color. The artist sees brightness or darkness. The artist sees the story that the bear tells. The artist sees the bear for what else the bear is. The artist sees the bear in a way that other people don't see it. For example, I needed all of my abstract thinking power to create this image, which was taken in the Namibian desert of Africa. I was in the middle of a dune field, and there were these dead trees that were rising out of a salt pan. But to me, it was more than just a collection of twigs. To me, this was a collection of shapes and colors, and there was a story to be told by these objects. So composition is really just trying to figure out how to take all of these abstract pieces and to bring them together in a coherent and pleasing design. The first concept I'm going to discuss is something called visual mass. Think of visual mass this way. Visual mass is a measure of the eye-catchiness of an element within your photograph. So something that's very big and prominent, like for example this picture of the bush with the shadow, this creates a very large visual mass. It automatically rivets the attention of the viewer and it dominates the composition. But visual mass doesn't have to be something related to size alone. Something relatively small can attract attention as well. So for example, with this image, the sun is very, very small, but because it's bright, it attracts the viewer's attention. It has a lot of visual mass despite its small size. Let's pause for a moment to talk more about this image. I took this photograph at sunrise in the Arizona desert. I waited for the moment when the sun came up just from behind the mountains, and I tried to create a dynamic visual relationship between the sun in the background and the prominent acacia bush in the foreground. Considering visual mass was helpful in allowing me to create this dynamic visual relationship. And now we're going to talk about space. Space basically is any area within the picture frame that's largely devoid of visual mass. So it's any area of the picture that's relatively empty. It doesn't have to be completely empty, but it's got less stuff in it than an area with visual mass. For example, with this photograph of an owl, the owl to the left represents visual mass, whereas the empty space to the right represents visual space. Here's a good example. I took this image, I was kayaking on Lake Huron, and I camped on this remote island, and it had this large flower pot feature, which was a rock feature that stood up about 30 or 40 feet above the island. When I made this photograph, there wasn't much going on in the sky, so I decided to use visual mass and juxtapose it against the visual space. I put the mass on the left and the space on the right to create a more dynamic composition. Now I'm going to give you the secret ingredient, the secret sauce, if you will, to successful composition. It's something I call dynamic balance. You want to create compositions that are energetic, that have a feeling of motion. You want to get the viewer's eye moving around to multiple parts of the image. But at the same time, you don't want to leave the viewer feeling jilted or uncanny. Too much energy and the composition is unbalanced. Too much balance and there's no visual interest. You want to find that perfect balance between energy and harmony. That's what I call dynamic balance. So this image here is a really good example of the successful use of dynamic balance. I was photographing these flamingos and I spent hours sitting in the mud waiting for the perfect arrangement of flamingos. They were constantly moving around, so I had to wait a long time until they finally arranged themselves in a pleasing way. So for this composition, you can see that there's actually a fairly balanced arrangement of the flamingos. There's the flamingo in the center, and then there's two flamingos on either side to the left or the right. What makes this energetic and dynamic is the fact that the spacing between the flamingos isn't the same. The spacing between the middle flamingo and the ones on the left to the right is farther than the spacing between the two flamingos on the right and the two flamingos on the left. Also, the fact that the flamingo that's closest to me, the one in the middle, is larger in the image frame than the other flamingos helps create more energy, makes the composition more dynamic. So it's balanced, it's very harmonious and pleasing to the viewer's eye, but it's also very energetic at the same time. Seeing the world in a different way is the key to unlocking the potential of your photography and to showing viewers something they've never seen before, the world through your eyes. Recognizing and working with shapes is critical to advanced image making. Shapes are the cornerstone of all compositional structures. Certain shapes help lead the eye and create compositional power. Learning to work with shapes is vitally important to mastering composition. Lines are, well, they're lines. They're basically shapes that have length but very little width. Lines are one of the most powerful compositional shapes. They have the ability to aggressively lead the viewer's eye deep within the picture frame. Although there's nothing wrong with using vertical and horizontal lines, you might want to think about the fact that diagonal lines tend to be a bit more powerful, and here's why. In our everyday life, we're used to seeing horizontal and vertical lines. You see the horizon, you see vertical lines on a building. Diagonal lines are a little bit less common. They cut across the grain. They really stand out. And as a result, they can create very energetic compositions. This image is a really good example of this. These lines were parallel lines, but because I used a wide-angle lens and got down really low for the image, it pushed them into the corners diagonally. These diagonal lines help pull the eye from the foreground to the background of the image. They bring the viewer into the picture frame. For this particular image, I used vertical lines in a very powerful way. I had several sets of vertical lines. I've got the stone towers in the background. I've got the rippled sand in the foreground. Now, note I'm using the term line a little bit loosely. Those ripples are obviously a little bit wavy, but they are more or less still lines. And the vertical orientation takes the eye from the beginning of the picture, from the foreground into the back of the picture, into the background. This image here, which I took on the coast of South Carolina, it's an old dead tree that's sticking out of the sand. When the sun was rising behind the tree, it created these diagonal vertical lines. You can see how effective and how powerful these diagonal lines, especially when they're radiating from the edges of the image frame, they're very effective at drawing the viewer's interest into the center of the image frame. Curves are line's more elegant cousin. Curves have the same power to lead the eye, but they do so in a less aggressive way. Curves encourage the viewer to meander through the image, to wander to multiple points within the image frame. For example, this is probably the most famous curve in nature. This is the Snake River Overlook in Grand Teton National Park, which was made famous by Ansel Adams. Here, the Snake River has an S-curve, which leads the eye into the scene. Zigzags are one of my favorite shapes. They're very similar to curves in that they encourage the eye to wander throughout the image frame. They hit multiple points within the image frame. Whereas curves are very refined, zigzags are very energetic. They force the eye to stop within multiple points of the image. It gives the image elbows. It forces the eye to zig and to zag, which, as we all know, is a lot of fun. For example, for this image of sunrise taken on the California coast, I had a very chaotic scene. It was hard for me to figure out a coherent composition. I relied on the zigzag shape, which is formed by the interaction of multiple visual elements in this scene to create compositional structure. Triangles are a very simple yet advanced compositional shape. In its essence, a triangle encourages the viewer to visit three distinct points within the image. Triangles are easy to use and they're very powerful because they can create energetic yet balanced compositional structures. When you're looking for triangles, don't just look for shapes that are obviously triangles. Look for the interaction of 3 points. 3 different elements working together can create a triangle. So, for example, with this image of the docks, you may ask yourself, where's the triangle shape? Well, as you can see, the intersection of the 3 docks creates a triangle shape. If you just imagine drawing a line from point to point, there it is, the triangle emerges. Here's another example of the importance of the triangle shape. When I was photographing this sea turtle in the Caribbean off the coast of Belize, I wasn't necessarily consciously thinking about the compositional shapes that might arise. I was just busy shooting as the turtle moved around. But I always keep these ideas in the back of my head. So when I had the turtle surfacing for air and I saw that it created this triangle shape, I knew I had something special. The triangle shape formed by the turtle's pose creates a composition that is both energetic, very dynamic, and balanced and pleasing at the same time. Circles and arcs are another very basic, easily recognizable compositional shape. And when I talk about a circle or an arc, you don't need a full circle. For example, the picture of the rainbow here is just a half circle, it's an arc. But it basically gets at the same idea. Circles and arcs are a very effective way of keeping the viewer's attention focused within the image frame. Spirals are related to circles and arcs in that they hold the viewer's interest within the compositional shape, but they're also very powerful compositional shapes because the viewer's eye wants to travel down the path of the spiral to the point where the spiral terminates. And this can be very, very effective at enticing the viewer deeper into the scene and holding their interest over time. When working with shapes, it's important to keep in mind that a repetition of shapes actually can be very effective compositionally. People, when they look at a pattern, they want to follow each and every discrete portion of the pattern. So if you have one shape in an image and you repeat it over and over again, the viewer's eye is going to want to hit all of those points where the shape is. For example, for this image, which is a picture of a dune field at sunset, there is a shape that is repeated over and over again that's created by the sunlit portions of the dune crest. The eye naturally wants to hit each and every one of those shapes. For this image, which is down in Chile's famous Patagonia region, I was photographing at sunrise. Actually, it looked like it was going to be a pretty bad sunrise. There were a lot of clouds, but suddenly the clouds broke up and this glorious sunlight came in and it was lighting up the mountains and lighting up the clouds. And it was happening very quick, so I had to decide on my composition in a split second. So what we see here is a very subtle shape repetition. You've got a shape created by the curve of the waterfall in the foreground, and that shape is repeated again by the curving shape of the hillside, and then a third time by the curving shape of the clouds above the mountain. This encourages the viewer to hit all three areas of the image, and perhaps after completing their journey, starting over at the beginning and starting to go through the pattern one more time. As a final example of shape repetition, I have a line of flamingos that I was photographing. What I really like about this image is that the flamingo shape is repeated over and over again, but each flamingo has a slightly different pose. That variation keeps the image from being too static, gives it some energy instead. Shapes are easy for people to recognize, and it's easy for people to connect with them emotionally. Moreover, they can help bring structure and coherence to your compositions. We live in a vibrant, three-dimensional world which is constantly in motion. When you take a photograph, however, you take that vibrant, three-dimensional world and you squish it down into a static, two-dimensional representation of a selective slice of the reality around us. How then do we recreate this illusion of energy, of motion, of three dimensions, of vitality in life? Composition is the answer. This is one of the main challenges of photographic composition. Learning to lead the viewer's eye deep into the image frame is one of the main ways of solving this problem. Getting close to nearby objects, what is known as a foreground, is a great way of establishing a visual relationship between near elements in the photograph and far elements. This creates a dynamic composition and helps encourage the viewer to travel deeper into the photograph. It's important to take some time to look for a good foreground, something that's going to help you achieve your goal of visually captivating your viewers and holding them and their interest in your composition over the long haul. Wide-angle lenses can be very helpful when you're working with a foreground, as you can get very close to nearby elements and exaggerate their size and importance relative to objects in the background. This allows you to create a visual relationship between near and far, which can be very effective. For example, with this image, I was down in Patagonia in South America, and I found this great mountain scene that was reflected in a still pool of water. I was tempted to just focus in on the mountains and the reflections in the water, but I knew I needed something more to create some depth and to create some additional compositional interest. So I backed up a little bit and I found this curving shoreline, and I used that as my foreground. Not only does this foreground add depth to the photograph, the curve of the shoreline perfectly frames the reflection of the mountains in the water. A really effective way of using foreground to create depth in your composition is to find a foreground which has visual elements that push the viewer's eye into the scene. These leading elements can be just about anything. They can be lines, they can be curves, they can be other shapes, or they can be a visual progression of multiple elements. The idea, though, is that they encourage the eye, they push the eye from the bottom of the image deeper into the composition. For this image, which are some giant sand dunes in Africa, I used the rippled sand as my foreground. The ripples in the sand create leading lines which push the viewer from the bottom of the image frame into the middle of the image frame. When you can't find a good foreground, sometimes you can create one. For this particular image, I got into the water so that I could create a foreground using the rushing water that was coming towards me. So I put on a pair of fishing waders and got in very safely, very cautiously. You want to be careful when you're working in moving water. But I managed to get in and find a way to use the flowing stream as a foreground to help lead the eye into the scene and to direct the viewer's eye where I wanted it to go. I used a similar technique for this image of a sea arch along the Scottish coast. I was in a very remote and wild area. There was no way that the viewer could actually physically travel with me to this location, but I still was interested in leading the viewer's eye where I wanted to go. So basically, by using leading elements, these rocks in the foreground, they all push the eye straight to the sea arch. I'm able to tell the viewer that that is what is important in my image. I'm able to transport them into the scene that I was viewing, that I was photographing, showing them something that they would never see on their own, but at the same time, still directing their eye to what I thought was important about the scene. Another way to think of this near-far style of photography is to think about it from bottom to top, which actually makes sense because right now we're talking about photographing two-dimensional representational art. We've lost that third dimension. You're trying to create the illusion of near-far, but the way to think about it is to think about the progression of visual elements from the bottom of the image frame up towards the top. So thinking about composition in terms of structuring visual elements from bottom to top is a real easy way of creating depth in your photographs and at the same time creating a visual progression that helps lead the viewer's eye deeper into the scene. Here's a good example of this desert scene from Joshua Tree National Park in California. I composed the image so that I had a distinct layering of visual elements going from bottom to top, starting with the rock in the foreground, moving on to the bush above that, moving on to the more distant boulders in the background, and finally up into the sky above. I used a similar technique for this Appalachian Spring image from the Shenandoah Mountains of Virginia. I started with the trees at the bottom, moved my way up to the valley fog that was actually down below, and then the mountains sticking out of the fog behind that, and finally I completed the progression with the sky and the clouds above. Using this bottom to top visual progression gives the photograph a feeling of depth, and it gives the viewer a sense of being there, which, as a photographer, is your job, to transport the viewer into a place that they'll never go themselves. I'm going to talk a little bit now about something called forced perspective, which is essentially using an optical illusion to make an object look near or farther than it really is, or larger or smaller than it really is. For example, here, with my tiny assistant, she's actually standing 20 or 30 feet behind me, but because we're working in a two-dimensional medium here, it looks like we're right next to each other, talking to each other, but it looks like she's a lot smaller than I am. Now, this isn't necessarily an everyday technique, but by understanding this concept of forced perspective, you can create dynamic visual relationships between elements within the picture frame. For example, with this image of a waterfall, I got really close with a wide-angle lens to the fallen tree and the boulders in the foreground, exaggerating their size and importance relative to the background waterfall. Now, the way this is finally rendered, the foreground elements look as big as the waterfall in the background. So the two items compete for the viewer's attention, whereas in reality, the waterfall was a lot bigger than the boulders in the log. I used the same technique in this sunrise image of the Arizona desert. I got really close, once again with a wide-angle lens, to the foreground cacti, making them look larger and more visually prominent as compared to the background mountains, which obviously in real life loomed overhead. By using this forced perspective technique, I was able to make the foreground and the background have equal visual interest, thus balancing the composition and creating a dynamic visual relationship between the two elements of the photo. Another element of this forced perspective technique is something that's known as diminishing scale, which is basically this. Objects of a similar size, as they recede into the distance, appear to the viewer to get progressively smaller and smaller. Diminishing scale helps create depth and the illusion of three dimensions. Also, as we're going to see very shortly, it can very effectively lead the eye deep into the image frame. For example, with this image of a field of wildflowers below Mount St. Helens, as you can see, the wide-angle perspective that I used makes the foreground flowers look larger than the flowers that are in the background. This creates an important perspective cue which allows the viewer to truly appreciate the scene as it was witnessed by the photographer in three dimensions. Wide-angle lenses can be very helpful when you're working with a foreground, as you can get very close to nearby elements and exaggerate their size and importance relative to objects in the background. Closely related to this idea of diminishing scale is something that's called vanishing point. Basically, the vanishing point is a point in the distance at which objects get too small to see. Now, this is a somewhat esoteric definition. I'm going to give you a concrete, real-world example of this. Even though we all know that railroad tracks are parallel, when you look down a set of tracks, they appear to recede in the distance, converging on a single point. That's the vanishing point. Vanishing point can be very effective at creating depth, but even more than that, it's extremely effective at encouraging the viewer to travel deeper into the scene. This was something that was a revolution in Renaissance art, The early Renaissance artists knew that vanishing point could help create a three-dimensional feel to their paintings, but they soon discovered that it was also effective at creating powerful and dynamic compositions. For example, with this photograph of an abandoned building, I used the bright area in the background of the image to my advantage. It helps accentuate the effect that was created by these radiating diagonal lines, so it re-emphasizes the vanishing point, but more than that, it evokes a feeling, it creates an emotion. The reason why vanishing point is so effective is that the converging lines naturally focus the viewer's eye on a single point. So long as that point is the most important part of your photograph, you're going to achieve what you want with that composition. You're going to get the viewer interested and drawn into the scene. Now, vanishing point can be created not just with lines, you can also create it with other shapes. For example, for this image of a stream running through a narrow sandstone slot canyon, I used vanishing point created by curves, the curve of the river as it meandered its way into the background. This technique takes the viewer on a visual journey from the bottom foreground part of the image all the way to the top. As you can see, getting close to the action is a really good way of creating exciting and dynamic compositions. When you're out there looking for compositions, always be on the lookout for ways to lead the viewer's eye into the world that you see within the picture frame. Our world is an extremely visually chaotic place. It is our challenge as photographers to find a way to cut through all the chaos and to focus our viewers' attention on what's important, our subject matter. At a very basic level, you want to make sure you don't have anything that unduly distracts from the main subject matter. So let's talk about a few techniques that can help you achieve this. Our first strategy for emphasizing our subject is simply simplification. You cut out anything you don't want the viewer to see. Instead, you focus your attention only on those elements that help you get your point across and help you tell the story of your subject matter. One really easy and effective way of simplifying your subjects is to use a telephoto zoom lens. So you can isolate a discrete portion of the scene and focus attention on that. For example, for this image, which is deep within the interior of a slot canyon in Arizona, I zoomed in and focused only on the most colorful and the most interesting part of the slot canyon. I made my composition the very simple C curving shape that's created by the glowing sandstone in the background. By excluding everything else, I was able to focus the viewer's attention on this simple shape and this simple color juxtaposition, creating a more interesting composition. Here's another example. This is a curve that was formed by the interaction of light and shadow at sunrise in the California desert. I made the simple curve itself the focus of my composition, excluding everything else, creating a very graphic and dynamic picture. I'm going to show you another set of images that demonstrate the different approaches you can take. One is going to show a wider view of the scene, and the second one is going to show the telephoto zoom view of the scene, where I zoomed in to isolate a discrete portion of the composition. So for this particular image, I was backpacking in the Patagonia Mountains. I got up about 4:30 in the morning in the dark. I climbed a glacier by my headlamp, and then I got up to this high pass in the mountains and set up waiting for sunrise. And when it happened to be one of the most glorious sunrises I'd ever seen, which was good because I'd spent several days getting to this location. So for this first image, I used a wide-angle lens. I included some foreground. The mountains are much farther in the background. They look much smaller in this picture frame. I think it's a good shot, but as you can see, it's a much different shot from the tighter view where I zoomed in and only focused attention on the mountains in the background. In this particular scene, the mountains are much more prominent, and it's a much more graphic look for the viewer. Both scenes have their merits, both are very different types of composition. The wider angle view is a bit more harmonious and balanced, whereas the tighter composition is more energetic and dynamic. Two very different approaches, but both of them valid. When working with a chaotic scene, sometimes an easy way to simplify things is to find one very bold graphic shape that will focus the viewer's attention and prevent them from lingering overlong on other more chaotic elements of the scene. This bold, eye-catching element becomes what I call a visual anchor. It is an obvious reference point, a place for the viewer to start their visual journey. For this image of a waterfall in Alaska, I got in the water and got close to this foreground rock and made it my visual anchor. This is the logical starting point for the viewer to begin their visual journey into the image. For this image, there was a lot going on in the scene. There was a lot that I wanted to show. There was a lot of story of the landscape that I wanted to tell my viewers. And I walked around for quite some time, several hours in fact, trying to find a way to bring the scene together. I had this this really big red sandstone mountain in the background, I had a bunch of dead trees that had been burned in a fire they had these silver skeletons. That was all that was remaining of the trees. There was so many visual elements that I had to work with, so much chaos. Finding this one bright, big, bold bush was the key element to tie the whole scene together. The viewer's attention is automatically focused on the bush. Now, the viewer is going to want to check out other parts of the image, the bright red mountain in the background, the colors of sunset in the sky, but the visual anchor is always going to draw the viewer back. This provides coherence and structure to the composition. Framing is a simple and effective tool for simplifying a composition and emphasizing your main subject. There's a lot of things in the natural world that you can use as a frame. I love to use natural arches or old barn windows as frames, but you can find frames anywhere. Two trees can be used to frame something more distant, an old bridge, just about anything you can imagine can be used as a frame. For this image, I used one natural arch to frame a more distant natural arch. Even though the distant natural arch is smaller in the image frame than the closer arch, because the closer arch was used to frame the distant arch, there's no doubt that the distant arch is the emphasis of the composition. For this image, I was hiking with a friend in a remote slot canyon in the Arizona desert. I used a gap in the sandstone to frame him and to create a whimsical yet effective composition that focuses all attention on him. For this photograph of a great blue heron, I decided to shoot through a screen of trees. By getting in really close with a telephoto lens, they were rendered as a pleasing out-of-focus colored blur. I used that color to frame the heron and to emphasize the main subject. Another way to simplify your compositions is to keep in mind that people have this natural tendency to try to organize the visual chaos they see around them. They tend to see shapes that are formed by the interaction of multiple elements. For example, think of a pine tree. When you look at a pine tree, you don't see it for what it really is, which is a chaotic jumble of hundreds of thousands of needles and branches. Instead, you tend to see it as a big triangle. I like to call this meta shapes, this tendency of people to see the world in an organized fashion. Use this tendency to your advantage. When you're working with multiple chaotic elements, look for simple implied shapes that arise from the interaction of a group of those elements. For example, for this image, which I took deep in the narrows of the Virgin River in Zion National Park in Utah, I formed a simple triangle composition that arose from the action of three elements within the picture. One of the boulders in the foreground, another boulder in the foreground, and the bright glowing canyon in the distance. This simple triangle shape creates a graphic and effective composition. Here's another example of meta shapes in action. For this picture at sunrise, there were two clumps of cottonwood trees which were in my foreground, and just a little bit of the mountain in the background peeking out of the morning mist. The three elements working together, the clump of trees on the left forms one point, the clump of trees on the right forms another, and the mountain in the background forms the third point. The three, when connected, forms a perfect triangle. Once again, this creates a dynamic composition because the viewer wants to visit each point of the triangle. On the other hand, this is a very structured and balanced composition. When two or more visual elements appear to converge, that creates an immediate and obvious point of interest for the viewer. They instantly want to look at that point where those two elements converge. For example, with this image of a mother seal and her pup, I wanted to show something that conveyed their interaction. I waited for a moment for the mother to bark at the pup. Their close proximity and the fact that their snouts almost touch creates an immediate focal point for viewers. It centers their attention on the interaction between the mom and the pup, and it keeps them from looking at the chaotic white background. Here's another example. This is a photograph of two elephants at a waterhole in Africa at night. The fact that the two elephants are facing each other and they almost appear to converge makes them the immediate point of interest for the photograph. The viewer's attention is automatically drawn to these two elephants. These tools will help you create compositions which are uncluttered, which make sense to your viewers, and which help you tell the stories that you want to tell to your viewers. Just putting in a little bit of thought can help you reduce the chaos of our world, and it can help you boil your subject down to its most important essence. The key to successful composition, creating a dynamic yet harmoniously balanced design, requires the ability to arrange and space visual elements in an energetic yet pleasing way. Let's start with something called the rule of thirds. I'm sure many of you have already heard of it. It's a very simple and basic rule, and it goes something like this. You mentally divide the picture frame both horizontally and then vertically. Once you've mentally created this rule of thirds grid, you look to place the most important visual elements within your picture either on the lines or the intersection of two lines. For example, this photograph I took on the Scottish coast, the rock, the most prominent element within the picture, is placed more or less at the intersection of a vertical and a horizontal line, whereas the horizon is placed pretty close to the upper third horizontal line. Now, notice how these elements are pretty close, but not necessarily perfectly aligned with the lines on the grid. There's no reason to be dogmatic about the rule of thirds. It's really just a guideline, so perfect placement isn't always necessary. Which brings me to my next point. Throw the rule of thirds out the window. If you really want to master composition, you need to move past the rule of thirds. It's not really a rule, it's only a guideline. It can be a useful guideline, but it can also be constricting. If you use the rule of thirds for all your photographs, then your photographs are going to look like everyone else's. Instead, I'm going to teach you some techniques that will give you a deeper understanding of composition and allow you to break free from reliance on the rule of thirds. One of my favorite techniques is something I like to call visual counterpoint. And this is a concept that I borrowed from classical music. If you think about some of the great symphonies, there's often a main theme, and then there's a separate sub-theme that's different from but relates to the main theme. The two themes, although different, work together to create a pleasing and harmonious sound. Visual counterpoint is the same thing. It happens when two or more visual elements within your composition work together. For example, with this photograph, which was taken during a sandstorm in the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, when I got to the top of this dune crest, the wind was taking the sand and pushing it off the dune crest. What I wanted to do is create a really dynamic and energetic composition. So I placed the setting sun over here on the far left in the upper left corner of the image. The counterpoint element is the shadow dune on the lower right-hand corner of the image. The two elements, the sun and the shadow of the dune working together, create an energetic yet harmoniously balanced composition, with the line of blowing sand connecting the two in the middle, completing the visual relationship. For this next image, which was taken deep in the wilderness in Patagonia in Argentina, I had this one lone hiker standing beneath the iconic Mount Fitzroy. By placing the hiker on the left-hand part of the image and the mountain on the right-hand side of the image, I was able to create a visual relationship between the two. For this next image taken on the southern Oregon coast, I created a counterpoint relationship between the rock in the foreground and the distant sea stack to the right in the background. Other elements in the scene, including the other sea stacks receding into the distance and the cloud in the sky above, help balance the scene. Another technique related to counterpoint is something I like to call opposing forces. Opposing elements, used correctly, can create significant visual energy within the picture frame. At the same time, they can encourage the viewer to explore multiple areas of interest within the composition. For this image of a stream flowing through a slot canyon, the unifying shape is the S-curve formed by the water flowing through the canyon. Other elements in the picture, however, create lines and angles that are all staggered at different angles, and this creates energy in the composition. For this next image, a dynamic weather event helped create opposing forces. Once again, we have a lot of different angles. All these different angles and lines create significant visual tension and keep the viewer's eye bouncing back and forth between multiple parts of the picture. If you really want to break free from the rule of thirds, then I encourage you to try centered compositions, something that I call the visual vortex. You may have been taught early on to avoid putting your subject in the center of the composition, and this can be pretty good advice. When people are first starting out, they've got an instinctive urge to point their camera at whatever their subject is, like their favorite pet or their son or their daughter. And this can often lead to static and boring compositions. However, you can successfully center your main subject. The trick is to find areas of off-center compositional interest, little pieces of the action that are off the center of the image that attract the viewer's eye away from the center. So here's a really good example. I was in a sea cave on Lake Superior. I had kayaked for several days to reach this remote area of the wilderness, and I waited for a day where the lake calmed down so I can get inside the cave. So I got out and I made a shot looking deep into the sea cave. And what I did is I created a centered composition. All of the lines radiate from the diagonal corners right into the center of the composition, which is obviously the main element of focus in the composition. But what I did is I created some visual interest away from the center of the image. I waited for a wave to come in and fill the space here at the bottom. That wave created a focal point away from the center, and it creates a counterpoint relationship between the wave and the center of the image. So the viewer's eye is bouncing back and forth between those two elements. The viewer wants to go to the center, but other elements within the scene pull them away from the center. And then they naturally want to go right back to the center. So you get this visual tug of war, which can be very effective. So you can use this to create a very effective centered composition. Here's another good example of a dynamic centered composition. For this shot, I was photographing the moon rising over some red sandstone features in the Arizona desert. And I chose a composition where all of these elements were centered. However, what I did is I created a visual relationship between these elements so that they create an abstract triangle. Once again, we get a visual tug of war between the center of the image and the points of interest away from the center. So by keeping this technique in mind, you can successfully center your subject, yet still have an image that isn't boring. Related to this concept of centered images are symmetrical images. So let's think for a moment of what might be a classic symmetry image. Say, for example, sunset reflected in a pond, where you visually divide the picture and give the sky and the reflection in the water equal treatment. These kind of photographs can be very effective and very beautiful. But one thing I like to do with my symmetrical images is to find a way to break up the symmetry ever so slightly, to find a simple point of asymmetry to draw the viewer's attention. So this gives you the balance that's created by the symmetrical image, but it also introduces a little bit of energy, a little bit of visual tension into the image that keeps things from being too static. This picture of zebras taken in Africa is a really good example. The way that the two zebras are posed almost looks like they are a mirror image of each other. But note how by introducing slight variations in their relative poses and their positions relative to the camera, that I was able to introduce just enough asymmetry to keep things interesting. Where you put visual elements within the image frame is the very essence of successful composition. You have to be careful to find the right balance between energy and harmony. If you have too much of one or the other, you can leave the composition unbalanced or too static. If you find the right balance, however, your viewers won't be able to tear their eyes away. A good composition means nothing if you can't connect emotionally with your viewers. Energy, light, color, mood, choice of subject matter, and the story that your subject tells, all of these can have a profound impact on the way viewers react to your photographs. Think of it this way. Composition is the cake, and mood is the tasty layer of frosting on top. One without the other doesn't make any sense. However, if you can find a way to successfully blend the two, viewers just can't wait to take a bite. Photographs that capture a sense of energy, motion, and vitality are much more likely to trigger an emotional response from viewers than compositions that are relatively static. Dynamic compositions can help create energy. This image here is a perfect example. This was a nighttime image. Streaking clouds formed by a 30-second exposure create radiating diagonal lines. These create a very dynamic composition, and they focus interest within the center of the image. Also, by getting in close to the foreground tree with a wide-angle lens, I was able to emphasize its importance in the composition and create a dynamic spacing of elements. All of these elements working together create a sense of vitality, and they create a mood for the viewer. Here's another example. Even though I didn't use a long exposure, I had radiating diagonal lines created by the position of the clouds in the sky. These lines, together with other bold leading elements, creates a very energetic composition. This is going to impart a strong sense of energy and mood for the viewer. If you really want to add some drama and punch to your images, look for areas of contrast. Contrast in terms of light, color, shape. Any element of contrast is immediately going to draw the eye and can add a real dramatic impact for your photos. For this image, the dark sea stack contrasts with the pastel colors from the rest of the scene, creating an immediate focal point. In addition, the leading line that's created by the outgoing wave in the foreground creates energy and pushes the viewer's eye into the composition. These elements working together create a dramatic effect. Also, the shape of the lines contrasts with the shape of the faint halo around the sea stack in the distance. All of these elements of contrast working together create a very energetic and powerful composition. One element of contrast that can be particularly effective is using complementary colors. Painters have long recognized that if you juxtapose colors that are opposite each other, these are known as complementary colors, you can create a very powerful effect. For example, warm colors, reds, yellows, and oranges, are opposite cooler colors, blues, purples, and greens. When you juxtapose these two colors, you create a very dramatic effect. For this particular image, I juxtaposed the cool blues of the water with the warm oranges of the glowing sandstone in the background. The effect is almost painterly. Here's another example of color contrast in action. This was a 30-second exposure I took in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. I was looking down at fog that was in the valleys below that was moving. This was taken about a half an hour after sunset during twilight. The only color that was left in the sky was this faint orange part of the sky that was glowing where the sun had set. And this I juxtaposed against the cool blues that were in the deep shadows. So what we have here with the blue clouds juxtaposed against the warm sunset sky is a very simple yet effective color-based composition that creates a very peaceful and tranquil mood. Everyone and everything has a story to tell. It is the photographer's job to figure out this story and then to find a way to present it in a compelling fashion to others. Story cues are what I like to call those visual elements that help tell the story of your subject, that get the viewers interested on an emotional level with what you photographed. For example, this image is of an old waterman plying his trade on the Chesapeake Bay. This is a dying way of life. There's not a lot of people who are still crabbing on the bay. So I wanted to convey a sense of nostalgia, a slight sense of sadness with this image. So I chose a composition that would help emphasize that effect. The radiating diagonal clouds formed by the incoming storm add a little bit of gloom and doom to the image. Most importantly, the downward glance of the fisherman conveys his story, his personal struggle, and the sadness of this dying way of life. Working together, all of these elements help create a story that the viewer can take away from the image. Here's another example of an image telling a story. This is a picture of an egret that was fishing for minnows in Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge in Florida. I took literally thousands of shots trying to get that perfect composition of a bird flying over the water, sticking its head in at the last moment to pull a minnow out. I wanted to focus the viewer on that story and that story alone, so I chose a simple, tight composition, and I waited for the moment for a graphic shape to emerge, which happened with this particular shot when the bird stuck its head in the water, its wings were spread out, creating this very effective and powerful triangle shape. Telling a story is not just for people and for wildlife, it's for landscapes too. For this particular image, I was photographing quiver trees in Namibia at night. There were all these moonlit clouds streaking overhead. So I wanted to tell the story that conveyed the mood of the magic of this place at night. I chose a really extreme wide-angle composition, including the tops of some quiver trees in the upper portion of my composition. And then, during the middle of my 30-second exposure, I walked behind the main tree in the shot and I shone my flashlight on it from behind. All of this taken together helped me tell my viewers the story of the unique eeriness of this place at night. It's often been said that the eyes are the window to the soul. A subject's eyes can tell you a lot about its story. Eye contact can be very effective and very compelling. For example, with this image of a hungry grizzly bear, the viewer can't help but react. It creates a sense of immediacy. It creates a connection between the viewer and the bear. As a matter of fact, I bet that the average viewer looking at this can't help but feel that he or she is the next item on the menu. So the eyes are important, even if the eyes aren't open. For example, with this picture of a red holler monkey in the jungles of Peru, the monkey's taking a nap. Even though the monkey's eyes are closed, they clearly tell a story, perhaps of a well-deserved rest at the end of a long day of monkey business. Never forget, there's no such thing as the rules of composition. In fact, what I've said today doesn't really matter. You have to find your own voice, your own path to artistic creativity. In the end, all you can do is photograph what moves you, and don't forget to shoot only for your most important critic, you.